Beaverhead County, Montana Territory, late autumn. The kind of season where every man with sense was racing the clock. Trees were being felled, logs were stacked, cabins went up fast because everyone knew the rule. If your walls weren't standing before the first hard snow winter would decide your fate for you. On the American frontier, there was a right way to build. Logs cut thick, corners locked tight, chinking packed hard, a stone fireplace big enough to crawl into. That formula had been proven by cold, hunger, and death. People trusted it because it had kept them alive. So when one man did the opposite, the laughter came easy. Instead of raising walls, he walked to a hillside with a pickaxe. Instead of stacking logs, he started removing earth. No foundation lines, no visible structure, just a growing hole in the side of a slope. To the settlement, it looked like madness. Men stopped on their way back from the timber stand just to watch him dig. Heads shook. Jokes were made. Some were nervous jokes. On the frontier, wasting time wasn't just foolish, it was dangerous. They said he was building a grave before winter even arrived. The problem wasn't that the neighbors were cruel, it was that they were experienced. These were people who had survived blizzards, starvation winters, and cabin fires. They had buried friends who didn't prepare fast enough. When they laughed, it came from certainty, not arrogance. In their world, heat came from fire, shelter came from wood, and survival meant separating yourself from the earth, not crawling into it. Digging into a hillside broke every rule they lived by. A hole couldn't keep out cold. Earth meant dampness. Dampness meant sickness. Sickness meant death. Everyone knew that. What they didn't know was that their certainty had blind spots. They believed winter was something you had to fight, that the colder it got, the harder you had to burn wood to push the cold back. No one questioned that assumption. No one had time to. That man in the hillside wasn't trying to outwork winter. He was trying to avoid fighting it at all. And that idea, more than the tunnel itself, was what truly unsettled the frontier. The man digging into the hillside was not young, reckless, or desperate. He was careful, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who watched before he spoke and measured twice before swinging a tool. His name didn't matter much to the settlement at first. He was simply the Norwegian. He had arrived with his wife and children carrying little more than tools. Warm clothes and habits formed far from Montana. Where he came from, winter was not a season. It was a permanent condition of life. Back home, cold wasn't something you complained about. It was something you planned around. You respected it or it buried you. What set him apart from his neighbors wasn't stubbornness. It was memory. He remembered houses that did not fight the cold with brute force. He remembered homes that worked with the land instead of standing against it. Places where fire was a helper, not a lifeline. On the frontier, most men built the way their fathers had built in Ohio, Missouri, or Kentucky. Log cabins were cultural inheritance as much as engineering choice. You built what you knew because learning something new took time, and time was the one thing winter never gave back. The Norwegian didn't have that inheritance. He had a different one. He understood something most settlers didn't yet realize. Wood burns fast, but earth holds heat slowly. Fire is expensive. Soil is free. A roaring stove can fail. The ground beneath your feet almost never does. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to prove Americans wrong. He wasn't chasing innovation. He was protecting his family. Every swing of the pickaxe was calculated, not rushed, not showy. He dug because he trusted the ground more than he trusted thin walls and endless fires. He dug because he knew exhaustion kills just as surely as cold. The neighbors mistook his silence for ignorance. In reality, he simply didn't feel the need to argue. Frontier life teaches a hard rule: explanations don't keep you warm, results do. So he kept digging, not upward toward pride or visibility, but inward toward stability, consistency, and a kind of safety most people had forgotten existed. While others raced to finish cabins before snowfall, he invested in something slower, heavier, and harder to undo. He wasn't building fast, he was building to last. The frontier cabin looked solid from the outside. Thick logs, tight corners, a stone chimney that promised warmth and safety. To most settlers, it felt like the strongest answer nature could be given. But in deep winter, that strength often turned out to be an illusion. A log cabin survives cold the same way a man survives a fistfight, by taking hit after hit and refusing to fall. Every hour heat leaks out through the walls, the roof, the floor. The colder it gets outside, the faster that heat escapes. Fire doesn't stop the loss, it only tries to replace it. That meant constant work. In brutal cold, a cabin stove couldn't be fed once or twice a day. It demanded attention every 45 minutes, sometimes less. Miss a feeding during the night, and the interior temperature dropped fast. Pipes froze, water turned solid, breath fogged the air and froze onto the walls. Wood became currency. Families measured their safety in stacked cords and shrinking piles. Every log burned was gone forever. Once the wood ran out, the cabin became a wooden box, sitting in the cold. Cabins also created uneven heat. Stand near the fire and your face burned while your back froze. Move 3 steps away and the warmth vanished. Walls stayed cold. Floors pulled heat from your feet. Children slept layered in clothes, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And then there was moisture. Warm air inside a cabin met cold walls and turned to condensation. That moisture froze, melted, and froze again. Over time, it soaked into chinking and logs, weakening the structure. Mold and rot followed in spring. A winter survived often meant repairs waiting. Most settlers accepted this as the cost of living. They believed winter demanded sacrifice, lost sleep, endless labor, burning eyes from smoke, and constant fatigue. Survival meant enduring discomfort and hoping your supplies outlasted the cold. What they didn't question was the assumption behind it all, that winter had to be fought with fire alone. The Norwegian understood something different. Fire was not the enemy's equal. It was a supplement. The real shield against cold wasn't flame. It was mass. And nothing on the frontier had more mass than the earth itself. Cabins tried to push winter away. The tunnel would let winter pass over it almost unnoticed. What the settlers called madness wasn't new at all. It was old, older than America, older than the frontier itself. Long before log cabins crossed the Atlantic, people living in hard climates learned a simple truth. The ground is warmer than the air in winter and cooler than the air in summer. That fact never changes. You can ignore it or you can use it. In Northern Europe, families built homes that leaned into hillsides or disappeared beneath turf and soil. In places where trees were scarce and storms were constant, wood was saved for tools and boats, not wasted on walls that bled heat. Earth became structure. Earth became insulation. These homes weren't crude shelters. They were carefully shaped spaces, entrances recessed, sleeping areas carved inward, roofs layered with sod that trapped warmth and blocked wind. Inside, temperatures stayed stable while blizzards raged overhead. The same idea appeared in different forms all over the world. In arid regions of Asia, people carved dwellings directly into Los cliffs. In the American Southwest, indigenous pit houses sank living space below ground level to escape both cold nights and scorching days. Across continents, cultures separated by thousands of miles reached the same conclusion without ever meeting. Earthworks. The frontier had forgotten that. Most American settlers came from forested regions where wood was abundant. They brought timber-based thinking with them, even into landscapes where it made little sense. When winter grew harsher, they responded by burning more fuel instead of changing the design. The Norwegian carried different memories. He had seen winter treated as a condition, not an opponent. He knew that soil didn't panic at -40. It stayed steady, reliable, unmoved. Digging into a hillside wasn't retreat. It was alignment. Instead of surrounding himself with thin walls and endless drafts, he chose thousands of tons of earth as his outer shell. Instead of relying on fire to hold back cold, he used fire to make small adjustments to an already stable space. To the frontier, this looked backward. In truth, it was refined survival logic stripped of pride and habit. The idea wasn't to conquer winter. It was to step out of its reach. Choosing the hillside was not an accident. It faced the low winter sun and turned its back to the hard northwest winds that cut across the valley. While others cleared open ground for cabins, he studied slopes, soil, and drainage like a man planning a long siege. He didn't rush the work. Every foot of earth removed was shaped with purpose. The tunnel angled slightly upward, not down, so cold air would settle near the entrance. Instead of flooding the living space, water would drain out, not collect. Gravity was treated as an ally, not an obstacle. From the outside, none of this was visible. All the neighbors saw was dirt piling up and a hole growing deeper. No walls rising, no roof beams, no smoke curling into the sky. On the frontier, visibility mattered. A structure you couldn't see didn't feel real. And if it didn't feel real, it couldn't feel safe. Men stopped offering advice and started offering warnings. Some were blunt, others were disguised as concern. They told him the roof would collapse, that frost would crack the walls, that moisture would rot everything he owned, that he was risking his family for a theory. He listened. He nodded. Then he kept digging. Inside the tunnel, the space began to take shape, not wide but intentional. Wide enough to live, narrow enough to control. The ceiling rose high enough to stand without trapping heat overhead. The walls were left thick, not smooth thin, for comfort or speed. He carved alcoves into the earth where beds would sit pulled away from the main airflow. He marked a corner where a small stove would rest, not centered, not dominant, just present. Fire was not meant to rule the space. At the entrance, he stepped the doorway back into the hill, creating a pocket where cold air could settle before it reached the interior. It was a small detail, the kind people dismiss because it doesn't look impressive. But survival is built on details that don't demand attention. As snow began to dust the valley, the tunnel was still unfinished. That worried his wife more than she admitted. Digging into the earth requires faith, not in hope, but in physics you can't see working yet. The frontier trusted speed. He trusted preparation. What finally took shape inside the hillside didn't resemble a cave or a cellar. It was organized, intentional. Every feature existed for a reason, not for comfort or appearance, but for control. The entrance was the first line of defense. It sat recessed into the hill, not flush with the outside air. Cold wind could rush past the opening without pouring directly inside. The doorway was narrow and solid, designed to be shut tight, not grand or welcoming, just effective. Step inside, and the tunnel opened into the main living space. The ceiling was high enough to stand, but not so high that heat would collect uselessly above reach. The width was modest. Big rooms waste energy. Small rooms hold it. The walls were left thick, not carved thin for ease. Thick earth meant thermal mass slow to change, slow to lose heat. The floor stayed dirt, not wood. Wood insulates poorly against ground cold and rots when moisture appears. Packed earth stayed stable and dry. Along the sides, sleeping alcoves were carved directly into the clay, each one set back from the main airflow. These were not afterthoughts. Sleeping is when the body loses heat fastest. Position matters. Depth matters. The earth wrapped those spaces in steady temperature, and simple canvas partitions trapped body warmth without sealing off fresh air. The stove was small, almost unimpressive. It sat in a corner, not at the center like a cabin hearth. Fire here was not the heart of the home. It was a tool. Its job was to raise the temperature slightly, not fight the cold outside. Above and behind it ran the ventilation shaft. Angled upward through the hill, it created natural draft. Warm air rose. Smoke exited. Fresh air was drawn in through the entrance without creating a hard current. No bellows, no fans, just physics. Nothing inside demanded constant attention. That was the point. The tunnel home wasn't designed to impress visitors. It was designed to let a family sleep through the night without waking to feed a fire, to let children play without frost forming on walls, to let winter exist outside without invading every hour of life. It wasn't primitive. It was efficient. And efficiency on the frontier was the difference between enduring winter and being consumed by it. The settlers didn't lack intelligence. What they lacked was language for what was happening inside that hillside. They judged buildings by sight and habit, not by forces you couldn't see working. But the tunnel home was operating on simple rules of nature that never needed names to function. 16 feet below the surface, the ground barely noticed winter, while air temperatures swung violently warm one day, deadly the next. The soil stayed steady. Cold moved slowly through earth, not quickly, like it did through air. By the time winter reached that depth, spring was already on its way back. That meant the tunnel started warm. Not fire warm, but stable warm. Around the temperature of a root cellar. Enough that a small amount of added heat made a big difference. Raising a space from 52 degrees to 65 took far less effort than dragging it up from below freezing. The earth acted like a battery. It absorbed heat slowly and released it just as slowly. When the stove burned, the walls didn't steal warmth, they stored it. Hours after the fire died down, the space stayed comfortable. Airflow mattered too. The ventilation shaft wasn't meant to blast air through the tunnel. It created gentle movement. Warm air rose and exited. Cooler air slipped in along the floor through the entrance. Moisture followed the moving air, not the walls. This prevented dampness without stripping heat. In a cabin, ventilation often meant drafts. Drafts meant cold, so people sealed cracks and trapped moisture inside. In the tunnel, air moved on its own, guided instead of forced. Even body heat mattered. In the sleeping alcoves, warmth from breath and skin stayed contained. Canvas held it without suffocating the space. At night, those small pockets ran warmer than the main chamber without any extra fuel. None of this was magic. It was balance. Fire added a little. Earth held a lot. Air moved just enough. Together they created comfort without struggle. The frontier builders weren't wrong about cabins. Cabins worked up to a point. What they missed was that survival didn't require working harder. Sometimes it required choosing a system that worked quietly in the background while you rested. And in winter, rest is not a luxury. It is survival. The real test came when winter stopped being theoretical. In mid-January, the temperature dropped hard and stayed there. Not the kind of cold that bites and retreats, but the kind that settles in and refuses to leave. Mornings opened at 30 below. Days barely climbed. Nights erased mistakes. This was the cold that exposed weak thinking. In the cabins, life narrowed to the stove. Fires had to be fed constantly. Miss one feeding and the room temperature collapsed. Men woke every hour, not because they wanted to, but because letting the fire die meant frozen water, frozen tools, frozen fingers. Sleep came in fragments. Eyes burned from smoke. Beards iced over indoors. Walls sparkled with frozen breath. Children stayed bundled even while sitting near the hearth, rotating like food on a spit to keep from going numb. Woodpiles shrank fast. Every family knew the math. Count the cords, count the days, guess wrong, and winter made the final decision for you. Cabins were loud in winter, cracking logs, popping ice. The constant sound of movement because stillness meant freezing. People stayed busy because stopping felt dangerous. Across the valley, the hillside stayed quiet. Snow drifted over the tunnel entrance and piled against the slope. Wind screamed overhead and moved on. Inside, life slowed instead of tightening. The stove burned small and steady, not roaring, not demanding. The difference wasn't comfort alone. It was mental. While others measured time in minutes between fire feedings, the family in the tunnel measured days. While neighbors fought their homes, the earth-sheltered space asked almost nothing from them. That contrast unsettled people more than warmth ever could. Cabins represented effort, sacrifice, and visible struggle. The tunnel represented something else: control without exhaustion, stability without constant labor. Frontier culture respected suffering. It trusted visible work. Quiet success made people uneasy. As the cold deepened, confidence in the old ways began to crack, not loudly, not publicly, but privately in the long nights when another log disappeared into the fire and the room still felt cold. Winter wasn't just testing buildings, it was testing beliefs. The visit was not planned as a lesson, it was meant as a welfare check. When one of the settlement's women finally made the walk to the hillside, she expected urgency. Blankets by the door, children wrapped tight, a fire pushed to its limit. That was what every other home looked like by then. What she found disrupted that expectation immediately. The door opened without hesitation. No blast of heat rushed out, no smoke followed. Inside, the air felt calm, warm but not heavy. The kind of warmth that didn't announce itself until you realized your shoulders had relaxed. The family wasn't huddled, they were living. Children moved freely, no boots, no gloves. The mother wore everyday clothing, not winter layers. Bread rose quietly on a shelf away from the stove, not pressed against it. The fire itself was modest, small enough to ignore if you weren't looking for it. The walls were dry. That detail mattered more than temperature. Every cabin in the valley was damp by then. Frozen breath-coated logs. Moisture crept into seams. Here the air moved gently, almost unnoticeably, but enough to carry humidity away. There was no smell of smoke, no stale air, just steady circulation. The visitor asked the only question that made sense. How much wood had they burned? The answer didn't sound possible. Not for that length of winter, not for that level of comfort. The number landed wrong because it broke the math everyone else was using. When the story reached the men at the trading post, it was dismissed at first. Stories grow in the telling. People exaggerate. Pride bends the truth. So someone else went, then another. Eventually, the man who had spoken loudest against the tunnel walked inside himself. He stayed longer than planned. He touched the walls. He stood still. He stopped talking. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a mild corner of the valley. It was a system working exactly as intended. That moment didn't just change opinions about one house. It forced a harder realization. They had confused familiarity with correctness. They had trusted what they knew without asking whether it was the best answer. On the frontier, admitting that kind of mistake takes more courage than facing the cold. But once seen, it couldn't be unseen. What finally convinced the doubters wasn't comfort alone. It was efficiency. Wood was life on the frontier. Cutting it took time. Splitting it took strength. Hauling it took daylight that winter rarely offered. Burning less wood didn't just save fuel, it saved people. In the cabins, survival had become a full-time job. Men rose before dawn to feed fires. They returned from chores already tired. Nights were broken into short stretches of sleep interrupted by alarms, set not by clocks, but by cold itself. Every hour demanded attention. That constant demand wore people down. Exhaustion leads to mistakes, missed feedings, poor judgment, slower reactions. In winter, fatigue was as dangerous as frostbite. A tired man makes bad decisions. A tired family runs out of margin. The tunnel home changed that equation. Because the ground held most of the heat, the stove no longer dictated the family's schedule. Fires could burn smaller and less often. One careful evening fire carried warmth through the night. Mornings didn't begin in panic. Nights didn't end in exhaustion. Fuel use dropped sharply, not by a little, by a lot. While other households counted cords burned per week, the tunnel household counted cords burned per season. That difference freed time. Time to rest. Time to repair tools. Time to tend animals without rushing back to the stove. Time matters more than comfort. Energy matters more than pride. The tunnel didn't just conserve wood. It conserved human strength. And on the frontier, strength was a limited resource. Once spent, it was hard to replace. Neighbors began to notice something else too. The family in the hillside looked better. Fewer coughs, clearer eyes, steadier hands. Warmth without smoke meant lungs got a break. Sleep without interruption meant bodies recovered. This wasn't luxury, it was sustainability. Frontier life punished inefficiency. Systems that demanded constant input eventually failed. Systems that worked quietly in the background lasted longer than the people who built them. The tunnel home didn't win arguments. It changed the math. And once the math changed, the future followed whether tradition approved or not. The tunnel home didn't start a movement. There were no meetings, no speeches, no declarations that the old ways were wrong. That wasn't how the frontier worked. Change moved quietly from one practical mind to another. Men didn't talk about the tunnel in public at first. They talked about it while splitting wood, while checking traps, while walking fence lines. Conversations started with numbers, not opinions. How much wood did you burn? How often did you feed the fire? Did the walls stay dry? Those were safe questions, questions that didn't challenge pride. What made earth sheltering spread wasn't belief. It was observation. People saw who slept through the night. They noticed who didn't look worn down by February. They paid attention to whose woodpiles lasted longer than expected. Frontier culture respected results even when it resisted explanations. The first men to ask about digging weren't dreamers. They were cautious builders, experienced ones. The kind who had lost friends to bad winters and didn't care where a solution came from as long as it worked. They didn't copy the tunnel exactly, they adapted it. Some built partial earth shelters banking soil against cabin walls. Others dug cellars that became living spaces during the coldest months. A few followed the idea all the way into the hillside. No one advertised it. The knowledge spread the same way most survival wisdom does, person to person, filtered through trust. A man listens differently when advice comes from someone who just survived the same winter he did. There was no shame in learning quietly. The frontier didn't reward pride. It rewarded staying alive. And once enough, people saw that Earth could do what fire struggled to accomplish. The idea took root without needing approval. It wasn't tradition that changed. It was priorities, warmth, rest, efficiency. Those things matter more than appearances when winter is long and unforgiving. By the time anyone admitted openly that the tunnel had been right, it no longer mattered. The Earth had already convinced them. The mistake the settlement made wasn't ignorance, it was certainty. They believed that because something had worked before, it must always be the best answer. Log cabins had carried people west. Fire had kept families alive through countless winters. Those facts were true. But truth, when treated as final, can become a trap. Frontier culture valued toughness. It respected visible effort. A man feeding a roaring fire all night looked like survival in action. A quiet home that asked for little felt suspicious. too easy, too different. What they got wrong was assuming that struggle proved correctness. They confused familiarity with superiority. Anything that didn't match their inherited picture of survival was dismissed as primitive, foreign, or unsafe. Not because it had failed, but because it felt unfamiliar. That attitude nearly cost a family their lives. The tunnel home forced an uncomfortable realization. Progress isn't always new. Sometimes it's older than memory. Sometimes the most advanced solution is the one that has already been tested for centuries in places where mistakes were fatal. The settlers also underestimated humility as a survival skill. Listening is harder than building. Admitting uncertainty feels dangerous when the stakes are high, but refusing to listen can be worse. The frontier punished arrogance just as harshly as cold. The Norwegian didn't bring innovation. He brought continuity. He carried knowledge shaped by generations who had no room for theory or pride. Only outcomes mattered to them. That knowledge wasn't better because it came from somewhere else. It was better because it had survived longer. The frontier had believed survival meant mastering nature. The tunnel home suggested something quieter and more durable. Survival comes from understanding limits of fire, of wood, of human strength, and designing within them. What they got wrong wasn't their work ethic. It was their assumption that endurance must always hurt. Winter doesn't care how hard you fight it. It only responds to systems that respect how it actually behaves. Once that lesson settled in, the frontier didn't look at the earth the same way again. What happened on that Montana hillside didn't stay in the past. The lesson didn't expire when the frontier closed. It waits quietly for moments when modern systems fail. Power goes out. Fuel prices spike. Supply chains break. When that happens, most people respond the same way frontier cabins did, by working harder inside fragile systems instead of questioning the systems themselves. Off-grid living isn't about rejecting modern life. It's about removing single points of failure. A house that requires constant energy input is fragile. A heating system that must run non-stop is fragile. A lifestyle that demands daily fuel deliveries is fragile. The tunnel home succeeded because it reduced dependency before adding complexity. The earth doesn't need maintenance contracts. It doesn't shut down in storms. It doesn't care about outages. It just stays the same temperature it has always been. Modern building science has rediscovered this under new names: thermal mass, passive design, earth-integrated construction. But the principle hasn't changed. Start from stability. Add energy only where it truly helps. The frontier mistake was believing resilience meant intensity. The real lesson is that resilience comes from buffering, from smoothing extremes, from letting nature absorb shocks instead of forcing humans to absorb them with labor and stress. For anyone thinking about off-grid life today, the tunnel home offers a clear message. Don't start with gadgets. Start with physics. Don't chase heat. Protect it. Don't fight the environment. Use it. Comfort matters, but reliability matters more. A system that works quietly without demanding attention gives people something no technology can replace: mental space. The ability to think, plan, and rest. In survival situations, that space saves lives. The hillside home didn't rely on heroics. It relied on design choices that lowered daily cost. That's the model worth remembering when modern convenience disappears. Because when systems fail, the earth doesn't. It never has. The tunnel home lasted longer than anyone expected. Long after nearby cabins sagged, burned, or were abandoned, the hillside stayed intact. The shape remained. The temperature stayed steady. Even when no fire burned inside, the space refused to become hostile. That persistence carried a message. The earth doesn't forget what works. Humans do. Each generation rediscovers the same truths under different names, often after repeating the same mistakes. We build fast. We overcomplicate. We rely on systems that demand constant input. Then winter or scarcity or failure reminds us what actually matters. The hillside home was never about cleverness. It was about humility, about accepting that nature sets the terms and that survival comes from aligning with those terms, not resisting them. The frontier learned that lesson slowly. They learned that wisdom doesn't always arrive dressed as progress. Sometimes it arrives quietly spoken with an accent, built in a way that looks wrong until the results make argument impossible. The man who dug into the hill didn't ask to be remembered. He didn't leave a monument. What he left was proof. Proof that efficiency beats endurance, that rest is a resource, that comfort earned through good design is not weakness. The earth held his home steady while storms passed overhead. It absorbed cold without complaint. It returned warmth without asking for fuel. That relationship hasn't changed. When modern systems fail, when power goes dark and fuel becomes uncertain, the ground beneath us still offers the same stability it always has. It waits for people willing to listen instead of dominate. The frontier thought survival meant standing tall against winter. The hillside taught a different lesson. Sometimes the strongest move is stepping back, stepping down, and letting the earth do what it has done for thousands of years. The earth remembers. Survival begins when we do too.